In the last video, we explored how this cognitive function appears in the conscious mind through the hero, parent, child, and inferior functions. But the story doesn't end there. The same cognitive function also exists in the shadow. It doesn't become a different function. It simply becomes less conscious, less trusted, and often reveals itself in very different ways. Let's take a look. Part 1. The function in the shadow. In part 1, we explored what introverted thinking looks like when it's part of the conscious personality. Whether it appeared as the hero, parent, child, or inferior function, it was still something the person could recognize, develop, and intentionally use. Even when it wasn't especially confident, it remained accessible. When introverted thinking moves into the shadow, the function itself doesn't suddenly become different. It still wants the same thing it always has: internal logical consistency. It still asks whether something actually makes sense, whether the pieces fit together, and whether a conclusion follows from its own reasoning, instead of simply being accepted because someone else said so. What changes is the person's relationship with that process. Instead of naturally trusting their own internal analysis, they become less certain about it. They may hesitate before relying on their own reasoning, second-guess their conclusions, or only engage deeply with logical analysis after something has already gone wrong. Introverted thinking starts operating more in the background, quietly influencing decisions without always being consciously acknowledged. Because of that, it often appears during moments of stress, disagreement, insecurity, or pressure. When life is running smoothly, the person may lean on other cognitive functions instead, but when something doesn't add up, when they're challenged, or when they feel uncertain, introverted thinking begins asking difficult questions. Sometimes those questions are incredibly helpful. Other times they arrive too late, become overly suspicious, or fixate on finding flaws instead of solving problems. The further introverted thinking moves into the shadow, the less consciously the person tends to engage with it. Instead of becoming weaker, it becomes less trusted. Instead of disappearing, it becomes something that surfaces in increasingly reactive and unconscious ways. The first place we see that shift is in the Nemesis position, where introverted thinking becomes something the person worries they can't rely on. Part 2. Nemesis Function. For ENTJ and ESTJ, introverted thinking occupies the Nemesis position. Here, introverted thinking often feels like an internal voice asking, "But does this actually make sense?" The problem isn't that the question is wrong. The problem is that the person isn't entirely confident in the answer. Someone with introverted thinking in the Nemesis position may worry that they've overlooked a flaw in their reasoning. Even after making a decision, they might replay the logic in their head, searching for hidden contradictions. They can become surprisingly defensive when someone points out an inconsistency, not necessarily because they're unwilling to listen, but because it touches an insecurity they were already quietly wrestling with. This creates an interesting contrast. Outwardly, they may appear decisive and confident, yet internally they may wonder whether their reasoning is actually airtight. They can spend more time than people realize trying to verify that everything fits together logically before fully relaxing. Imagine finishing a project at work. Everyone else thinks it's complete, but one small detail keeps bothering you. You keep reopening the file, rereading instructions, checking calculations, or mentally replaying the entire process because you're worried there's a logical mistake hiding somewhere. Sometimes that caution is valuable. It catches genuine errors before they become bigger problems. But when insecurity takes over, the search for certainty can become endless. Every answer raises another question. Every explanation suggests another possible exception. Instead of providing confidence, introverted thinking becomes something that constantly asks whether confidence is justified. This can also create suspicion toward other people's reasoning. If someone presents an argument that feels inconsistent, the Nemesis function immediately notices the possibility that something isn't adding up. The person may not openly challenge it at first, but internally they're asking, "Does this actually make sense, or am I missing something?" The irony is that their analysis is often quite accurate. The difficulty lies less in their ability to reason and more in trusting when their reasoning is sufficient. As introverted thinking moves even deeper into the shadow, that uncertainty often transforms into something sharper: criticism. Part 3. Critic Function. For INTJ and ISTJ, introverted thinking occupies the critic position. The critic doesn't simply question logic, it judges it. Instead of quietly wondering whether something makes sense, this position becomes highly aware of flaws, inconsistencies, and imperfections. Unfortunately, that critical eye is often directed inward first. A person may think, "I should have seen that mistake," Or, how did I overlook something so obvious? Even minor logical errors can feel disproportionately frustrating because the critic expects internal reasoning to be precise. It sets an extremely high standard that can be difficult to satisfy. That self-criticism can become exhausting. After making a decision, they may replay every step of the reasoning process, looking for where they could have been more accurate. If they discover a mistake, they may judge themselves much more harshly than anyone else would. Eventually, that same critical perspective extends outward. When someone else's reasoning seems inconsistent, incomplete, or poorly thought out, the critic notices almost immediately. They may find themselves mentally dismantling arguments piece by piece, identifying weak assumptions or pointing out contradictions that others completely missed. Sometimes this is genuinely useful. They can identify problems that save an entire project, expose faulty planning, or prevent expensive mistakes. Their critical analysis can dramatically improve the quality of ideas when it's delivered constructively, but under stress, the focus shifts from improving ideas to attacking flaws. Instead of asking how something can be made better, the critic becomes preoccupied with everything that's wrong. Conversations become debates over technicalities. Small logical inconsistencies feel much larger than they actually are. Even when they're correct, people around them may experience the criticism as discouraging rather than helpful. The challenge isn't the accuracy of the analysis. It's remembering that identifying flaws is only half of good reasoning. Eventually, the analysis also needs to move towards solutions. When introverted thinking moves another step into the shadow, even that critical clarity begins to break down, giving way to confusion. Part 4. Trickster Function. For ENFP and ESFP, introverted thinking occupies the trickster position. The trickster is often described as a blind spot, and introverted thinking illustrates that idea particularly well. Because this function operates so unconsciously, the person may not realize when their internal logic has gaps. They often feel like their reasoning is perfectly clear, only to discover that other people can't follow how they arrived at their conclusion. The reverse happens too. Someone else carefully explains their reasoning step by step, but somehow it still feels confusing or unnecessarily complicated. They may hear the individual facts, yet miss how those facts connect into one internally consistent framework. This can create mixed signals in everyday conversations. Imagine assembling furniture with a friend. The instruction manual lays out a sequence of logical steps, but instead of following that internal structure, the person jumps ahead because something looks right. Surprisingly, it sometimes works anyway. Other times, they discover they've built half the frame backwards and have to start over. The interesting part is that they often don't understand exactly where the reasoning went off track. Instead, they may become distracted by exceptions, unrelated possibilities, or alternative interpretations that unintentionally pull attention away from the central logic. They aren't trying to be illogical. They're simply less aware of how introverted thinking naturally organizes information. This can also lead to accidentally sending mixed messages. They might explain something in a way that feels obvious to them but leaves everyone else asking follow-up questions because important logical steps were never communicated. From their perspective, the missing pieces seem self-evident. From everyone else's perspective, the explanation skipped the entire bridge connecting point A to point B. Ironically, the trickster can also use confusion as a defense mechanism. When challenged with detailed logical arguments, they may unintentionally redirect the conversation, change the frame of discussion, or introduce new possibilities that make the original issue harder to pin down. They're not necessarily trying to deceive anyone. Often, they're simply navigating a part of their own mind that feels difficult to access directly. Most of the time, this blind spot is relatively harmless, but under extreme psychological pressure, introverted thinking can emerge in its most unconscious form of all. Part 5. Demon Function. For INFP and ISFP, introverted thinking occupies the demon position. Most of the time, this function remains almost completely out of awareness. These individuals rarely experience life through constant internal logical analysis. Other cognitive functions naturally guide their decisions long before introverted thinking has an opportunity to step forward. That doesn't mean it isn't there. It simply stays dormant until extraordinary circumstances force it into action. During periods of intense psychological pressure, prolonged conflict, betrayal, or crisis, introverted thinking can suddenly emerge with surprising intensity. Instead of its usual quiet search for internal consistency, it may become cold, detached, and relentlessly analytical. The person may begin dissecting every conversation, every motive, and every decision with almost surgical precision. Emotional nuance can temporarily fade into the background as they focus entirely on whether everything fits together logically. Sometimes this becomes destructive. Relationships may start feeling like problems to solve instead of people to understand. Every inconsistency becomes evidence. Every contradiction demands an explanation. The person may isolate themselves inside endless analysis, convinced they have to figure everything out before they can trust anyone again. Because this function has remained so unconscious for so long, it often lacks the balance that comes from regular use. It can swing from almost non-existent to overwhelming with very little middle ground. Fortunately, the demon isn't a permanent state. As self-awareness grows, people often become better at recognizing when they're slipping into this pattern. They learn that extreme analysis doesn't always produce better answers, especially when it's being fueled by fear or emotional pain rather than genuine curiosity. Over time, introverted thinking can become an unexpected source of resilience. During genuine emergencies, when emotions are running high and everyone else feels overwhelmed, the ability to briefly step back and analyze a situation with clear internal logic can provide stability instead of destruction. Rather than becoming consumed by relentless analysis, they can borrow just enough of introverted thinking to separate facts from assumptions, identify what actually makes sense, and make calmer decisions under pressure. The function itself never changed. It was always seeking internal logical consistency. What changed was the person's relationship with it. As awareness increases, even a function that normally lives in the deepest part of the shadow can gradually become less frightening, less reactive, and more available as a quiet source of strength when it's truly needed. By now, hopefully you've seen that this cognitive function never actually changed. Even in the Nemesis, Critic, Trickster, and Demon functions, it remained the same underlying cognitive process. What changed was the person's relationship with it. Rather than being trusted and consciously relied upon, it became less conscious, less trusted, and often revealed itself during moments of stress, insecurity, or psychological pressure. Understanding the shadow isn't about labeling parts of yourself as good or bad. It's about recognizing that every cognitive function has both conscious and unconscious expressions, and that becoming aware of them is an important step toward understanding both yourself and others.